Okay, so a couple of weeks ago I made a video touching on why I believe Payday 3 needs to be careful with the next update. The main reason being that if Boys in Blue releases in the next update or so and there haven't been any of the major Operation Medic Bag improvements, then any returning players the DLC's release may bring will just be a flash in the pan. We now know that Update 6 will be released either this week or next week and brings with it the new Shot Grenade, Quick Play and Party Merging, and thanks to Dev Update 4 that came out on Tuesday, we now also know that the ability to skip intro cinematics is coming, as well as a lot of crash fixes that apparently address 98% of crashes. Of course, none of these are major Operation Medic Bag changes, just another two ticked off of the initial focus list. This does worry me because, as I've said, if some of the larger changes aren't in the game by the time a new heist comes out, the players will leave just as fast as they've come back. And I'm pretty sure, or at the very least I bloody hope, that Starbreeze know this, and it's one of the reasons why we've not got a new heist just yet. But if so, that means the next update won't have one either, given that Starbreeze have been aiming for a 4 to 6 week window between update releases, and granted they are staying closer to 4 weeks, that still places us at least 8 weeks away from another heist. Of course, Starbreeze could release some of the big Operation Medic Bag changes alongside a new heist, but from where I'm sitting, I see that as very risky. So 8 weeks seems to be what I think we'd be waiting for the next heist. Or at least that's what I would say if it wasn't for this week's blog post about difficulty and loud modifiers. Before we talk about this blog post in depth, let's stay on the topic of dates for a moment longer. These modifiers are not part of the upcoming update, nor is the LMG, which we'll learn more about next week. But as they are mentioning them now, I can imagine that they'll be included in the next update. In fact, the blog post actually goes on to say that they're aiming for a release window of May to June. And looking back at the last few updates, a new weapon, loud modifiers, and maybe 1 or 2 items from the Operation Medic Bag's initial focused list seems like the amount of content we've come to expect from a Payday 3 update at this point. But if these things do become Update 7, we then need to hope that Update 8 includes some of the headlining Operation Medic Bag features, so that Update 9 can have a new heist, which then places that new heist at least 12 weeks away. And to put that into context, 12 weeks after this video goes live is the 21st of July, just 2 months before the game's first year comes to a close, by which we were supposed to have had 4 fully fledged DLC packs, and who knows how many free heists. Anyway, to conclude that rant about update windows, I wanted to highlight that I think Payday 3 needs some of the promised big changes before releasing a new heist, and currently, if we're going to get these changes before a new heist, that is what the timeline could look like. End of the day, that is highly speculative, but based on enough facts that I can say, I hope we don't have to wait 12 weeks for a new heist, but it wouldn't surprise me if we do. Now, let's talk about this week's blog post, and I'm sorry to say that this video isn't really going to be getting more positive. I'll be honest and say that I don't really like how this blog post is laid out. It's stylized like an interview with the game's director Mio, but also tries to deliver facts and intended changes like a traditional blog post, and ends up looking like a spillage of words onto a page. It almost feels like this is the kind of page someone internally at Starbreeze is always given, and then they write it up into a consumer-friendly manner, which is then put on the website. But I don't mean to be nitpicky, I'm always happy to get more information. Just last week I called out the brevity of the last blog post, but I almost feel like I needed a guide video to break down this week's blog post, and so I'll do my best to sum up the post and give my thoughts where I feel it necessary. So Mio starts off by addressing how the recently added adaptive armor and fortitude skill line have impacted the game's difficulty, going on to explain that he knew it would make the game easier, but also saw that it made the game more entertaining, which I do agree with. But now he plans to increase the difficulty in other ways to counteract the lower difficulty, and I just hope this doesn't mean that the game's difficulty will become balanced around fortitude and adrenaline to the extent where other builds suffer. After all, this system and skill line were introduced to be an alternative to the armor meta and have since taken over as the new meta. What that says to me is that these things need to be nerfed and rebalanced, not that the game needs to be made harder, as that really runs the risk of leaving other builds behind. Mio says they want to alternate giving players more power and options with making the game harder, which from my perspective sounds like a terrible idea, to be completely honest. It runs the risk of simply shifting the balance of the game too far with each update. One update the game's too hard, and the next it's too easy. I'm sure Starbreeze would eventually work out the right way to change things with each update, but how long would that take them? Anyway, the next section of the blog post is actually one that I'm quite happy to see. As long as this segment may seem, what it actually boils down to is that the armor penetration of cutting shot is being moved to the high grain skill. So instead, high grain will offer players 30 seconds of armor penetration, and it's noted that the 5% damage increase from each other player running the skill is still present. I think this is a really good change. It still keeps the armor penetration effect in the game while giving ammo bags more use. Frankly, I hope that the armor penetration remains just as overpowered as it currently is, as now that it's limited to 30-second intervals, it won't make heist as easy, unless you and your team specialize into making sure you have the maximum charges for each of your ammo bags and can therefore keep the effect up for much longer. But at that point, you would have tailored your build to revolve around the effect and no doubt have spent a bunch of skill points doing so. And I think at that point, you've earned that power. It's no longer a couple point investment that trivializes the entire game, but instead, arguably a whole new build. The next two segments of the blog post I want to talk about, despite being separated by half of the post, actually go hand in hand and, interestingly enough, appear in the opposite order to how we'll be looking at them today. The first is simply a mention that a difficulty higher than overkill is coming after year one. I really don't like that we're seeing this, not because I don't want more difficulties, I don't really have an issue with that, it's just that Starbreeze said before launch that they didn't want to add another difficulty, so this just reads as them saying, yeah, we've messed up and added some things we didn't really have planned, and now we need to add another difficulty. It's something that they weren't planning on doing and will need to allocate resources for in the future, which would be fine if we had confidence in the rest of their pipeline and their ability to deliver content at an acceptable rate, but right now, it just doesn't look good. But the second segment is about what their plans are to adjust difficulty in the future, where they refer to the new difficulty despite not having mentioned it at this point in the blog, as well as talk about the potential plans to increase the damage special enemies do, specifically to adrenaline, and rolling out the techie to all other heists. There are vague references to upcoming systems, but no actual further information given about them, so there's nothing to really talk about. And then they go on to talk about weapons, mentioning that they're looking to add long-term rewards to weapons. This is likely the prestige system we've heard about, but then they also say this, and I'm going to read this verbatim for reasons that will become apparent shortly after. We are in the early discussions of updating the weapons to emphasize their subfamilies more, like having battle rifles under the assault rifles umbrella, and we plan to have these subfamilies have a more direct impact on your builds. Now that leaves me with one question, and that's, what on earth does that actually mean? Seriously, I understand the words that I'm saying, but I can't for the life of me tell you what this actually means for the game. But anyway, now we get to the main topic of the blog post, the loud modifiers. Before we jump into this, I just want to take a moment to say that if you are enjoying this video, please do consider subscribing. I don't often ask for subscribers in the middle of a video, but if you've made it this far into one of my longer videos, then it may be something you're interested in. But anyway, I digress. Mio outlines his philosophy behind these modifiers, saying the loud modifiers are there to counter players' strategies, giving the pretty good example of the lead guard causing players who may normally just take out as many guards as possible when stealthing to rethink their approach. And with that philosophy in mind, let's take a look at the upcoming loud modifiers. Hard bargain. Players can't leave custody without hostage trades. Getting a player out of custody costs one hostage plus one additional hostage for every time they've been in custody or have killed a civilian. Ooh, we're not off to a good start, are we? While I don't hate this modifier, I think it will make the game much more micromanagement intensive, which is something that we've wanted to move away from with armor since the very early days of Payday 3. Mio himself says that this was initially intended to be the default way custody worked in Payday 3 before it was removed for being too difficult, and I can see why. I actually quite like that it gives us another use to hostages, adding an extra point of consideration before trading them, but that's about where the good ends for this modifier. It's got me asking questions like, does trading one hostage count towards releasing all players, or do we need to get them back one at a time? Then, if there are two bots and a player in custody, will it prioritize the player? And if one player kills a handful of hostages, does that increase the amount needed to be traded for any player to be released, or just the player with the high body count? And going back to that first question, if one player has killed 7 hostages, for example, meaning that we need to trade a total of 8 hostages to get them back, and a player who goes into custody after that player only needs 1 hostage to be traded, if there's no prioritization and hostages aren't shared, does that mean that the player who hasn't killed any hostages still needs 9 to be traded for them? Even without answers to all these questions, this modifier doesn't look good to me, purely based on what it does to the economy of hostages as a resource. But now for an actual good modifier, the buddy system. Up to 2 instances of each special can spawn, and the special cap is raised by 1. It's as plain and simple as that, and I quite like that as a modifier. I don't, however, like armor piercing as a modifier, where 10% of damage law enforcement deals to armor is also applied to health. This seems horrible, and frankly, if this was a modifier on a heist, I'd choose not to play. It fundamentally changes the way armor works for the worse. This could be a cool modifier for an armor type itself. Say the armor type can take more damage than regular armor before breaking, but lets some damage slip into your health. But as it stands for a difficulty modifier, no thank you. I'd much rather play with Alpha Strike, where regular SWAT units are replaced with Heavy SWAT. Another relatively simple but effective modifier. I don't necessarily agree with Mio that Heavy SWAT are a noticeable difficulty spike during a heist, but I still like the modifier quite a bit. I'm also interested to play with the Reflector Shields modifier, where shields come equipped with a light that can blind players. I understand that this is similar to the Marshall shields from Payday 2, but as they were introduced in the Lost in Translation heist, they never actually made it to the console version, so while I've heard that they were annoying, I can't speak from experience, so I'm excited to see how they work in Payday 3. For the last and definitely my least favourite modifier, we have debilitating specials, where players disabled by zappers and cloakers, damaged by nader gas, or hit by shields and dozer melee attacks will lose any stack of edge, grit, and rush. This seems so frustrating to me, and frankly, so do most of these modifiers. When I initially thought of loud modifiers, I had things like special enemies can spawn from the first wave, or each wave will have an FBI van that you need to take out, or perhaps even Captain Winter's coming back. And while some of these modifiers are okay, like Buddy System or Alpha Strike, the others would simply stop me playing the heist, if I'm being completely honest. Thankfully, these modifiers are only available on very hard and overkill difficulty. But anyway, as I said a couple of weeks ago, I'm actually playing and enjoying Payday 3 again, and I still am, but the fact that we can anticipate these modifiers and I'm expecting the game to be less entertaining because of them isn't a good sign. To end with a silver lining, I wanted to mention that this blog post at times references the upcoming progression changes, and so hopefully the progression overhaul is on its way too. Perhaps in the update after the one we're getting in the next week or so. If that is the case, and update 7 contains the new LMG, loud modifiers, some initial focus points, and the progression overhaul, that may pave the way for a heist in around 8 weeks' time. I really don't like to be negative in my videos, but transparently, this week's blog post was atrocious. There are even some things that Mio said that I didn't cover, as it lends itself to its own video about the direction Payday 3 is heading in and the philosophy behind it. But for now, that is just about all we have time for, and so with that all said, thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, drop a like on the video. If you disliked the video, drop a dislike on the video. Thank you very much for watching once again, and I will see you in the next video. I'm on the road.